What if I told you that the most advanced stealth fighters in the world were taken down by a jet everyone called scrap metal? That a veteran pilot everyone had written off proved that decades of experience could outmaneuver cutting-edge technology. This is the story of Captain Elena Vasquez and the day she shocked the entire Air Force with an aircraft they'd given her as a joke. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Captain Elena Vasquez walked the flight line with measured steps. Her worn leather flight jacket hanging loose over shoulders that had carried more responsibility than most colonels twice her age. At 42, she moved with the deliberate economy of motion that marked career pilots, each gesture purposeful and precise. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that had gone slightly gray at the temples, and her brown eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen combat in 3 different theaters over 2 decades of service. Elena's boots clicked rhythmically against the concrete as she passed row after row of gleaming F-35 Lightning II fighters, their stealth surfaces drinking in the Nevada sunlight like expensive sculptures. Young pilots clustered around these aircraft like moths to flame, running their hands along the smooth composite materials and discussing thrust-to-weight ratios with the enthusiasm of teenagers talking about sports cars. They wore their flight suits with the swagger that came from flying the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. Machines that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. None of them looked up as Elena passed. She had become invisible to them long ago, just another piece of base infrastructure that kept the real mission moving forward. The few who did notice her presence exchanged knowing glances and half-smiles that carried the casual cruelty of those who believed their youth and modern equipment made them inherently superior to anyone who had come before them. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a fresh-faced pilot barely 2 years out of the academy, leaned against the wing of his F-35 and watched Elena's progress across the tarmac. "There goes Grandma Vasquez again," he said to his wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, loud enough for Elena to hear. "Still walking around like she belongs with the real pilots." Chun laughed and adjusted her helmet bag on her shoulder. "I heard. She used to fly at 10s in Afghanistan. Probably thinks she's still relevant because she knows how to work a gun run against guys with a K-47s. The mockery was casual, practiced, delivered with the confidence of people who had never been tested by anything more challenging than simulator exercises and training sorties against predetermined targets. Elena had heard variations of these comments for the past 2 years, ever since her transfer to Nellis had placed her among pilots young enough to be her children, flying aircraft that represented quantum leaps beyond anything she had trained on. What they didn't know, because none of them had bothered to ask, was that Elena's service record read like a greatest hits compilation of close air support operations. She had flown more than 400 combat missions across Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, earning a Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and a reputation among ground forces as the pilot you wanted overhead when everything went sideways. Her call sign, Steady, had been earned during a mission in Kandahar when she'd held a firing position for 47 minutes straight, providing cover for a surrounded Marine unit while taking ground fire that had punched 17 holes through her aircraft. But that was ancient history to the F-35 generation. The wars Elena had fought were yesterday's conflicts, resolved through tactics and equipment that seemed primitive compared to the sensor fusion and stealth capabilities that defined modern air combat. The young pilots at Nellis trained for peer-to-peer conflicts against enemies with advanced surface-to-air missiles and sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. They flew aircraft that could see targets hundreds of miles away and engage them with precision weapons that could thread the needle between buildings without collateral damage. Elena's experience in low-altitude gun runs and danger-close support Missions seemed quaint by comparison, like a blacksmith trying to work in an automotive factory. The institutional memory of her generation was being systematically replaced by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and weapon systems that reduced the human element to a supervisory role. Why learn to dogfight when your missiles could engage targets beyond visual range? Why master low-altitude navigation when GPS and terrain-following radar could thread you through mountain valleys automatically? The answer to those questions lived in Elena's muscle memory and professional instincts, built through thousands of hours when mechanical failure or enemy action could strip away all the technological advantages and leave nothing but pilot skill and aircraft performance to determine who went home alive. She had learned to fly by the seat of her pants because that was often the only option available, developing an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that couldn't be programmed into computers or taught through simulation. At the Squadron Operations Building, Elena pushed through the glass doors into air conditioning that carried the familiar scent of jet fuel, coffee, and the particular brand of industrial cleaner used throughout the Air Force. The walls were covered with photographs of current squadron members posed in front of their F-35s, along with mission patches from recent training exercises and deployment rotations. Elena's photograph was absent from the current displays, relegated to a dusty corner near the administrative offices where heritage personnel were acknowledged with the same enthusiasm reserved for outdated equipment. The squadron commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, stood near the scheduling board with a cup of coffee in one hand and a tablet computer in the other. Webb was a F-35 pilot himself, having transitioned from F-16s just as the Lightning II program reached full operational capability. He embodied the modern Air Force approach to leadership, data-driven and metrics-focused, with little patience for the intuitive flying that had characterized previous generations of fighter pilots. Webb glanced up as Elena approached, his expression shifting to the careful neutrality that superior officers maintained when dealing with subordinates they considered marginally useful. "Morning, Vasquez," he said, his tone carrying the obligatory courtesy that military protocol demanded. "I've got some news about your assignment." Elena stopped in front of the scheduling board, noting that her name was conspicuously absent from the training rotation that filled the coming week with air-to-air exercises, ground attack simulations, and formation flying practice. "The good news," Webb continued, "is that you're getting your own aircraft." He paused, letting the moment hang in the air before delivering the punchline he had obviously been savoring. "The less good news is that it's not exactly what you might call cutting-edge technology." Elena maintained her professional expression, waiting for Webb to explain what assignment he thought passed for humor. Webb gestured toward the far end of the flight line, where a lone aircraft sat apart from the pristine F-35 formation like a poor relation at a family reunion. Even from a distance, Elena could see that the aircraft was different, its angular silhouette belonging to an earlier generation of fighter design. "That's an F-16C that just came out of depot maintenance," Webb said. "Originally built in 1987, upgraded more times than anyone can count, and generally regarded as the kind of aircraft we keep around for sentimental reasons rather than operational necessity." The aircraft in question was Block 25 F-16C, tail number 841234, that had served with multiple squadrons over more than 3 decades of operations. Its paint scheme was regulation Air Force gray, but weathered in a way that spoke of countless hours in harsh environments. Unlike the smooth, seamless surfaces of the F-35s, the Fighting Falcon showed its age through panel lines, access hatches, and the subtle wear patterns that accumulated over years of maintenance, cycles and mission requirements. Webb's smile carried the particular satisfaction that came from delivering what he considered a perfect practical joke. "The aircraft needs a pilot for some upcoming exercises, and since you're our resident expert on older systems, we thought you'd be the perfect match." The implication was clear without being stated directly. Elena was being assigned to the outdated aircraft because she herself was considered outdated, a pilot whose experience belonged to the same era as the airframe she would be flying. Surrounding pilots had gone quiet, sensing the entertainment value in Webb's announcement. Elena could feel their attention focusing on her reaction, waiting to see whether she would protest the assignment or accept the implicit demotion with grace. What they expected was resignation or frustration. What they got was something completely different. Elena looked out the window at the solitary F-16, its weathered surfaces and angular lines representing everything the modern Air Force had moved beyond. But where others saw obsolete technology, she saw potential that had been forgotten rather than disproven. The F-16 was a pure fighter, designed when pilot skill mattered more than sensor fusion, when aircraft performance was measured in sustained turn rates rather than stealth cross-sections. "When do I start?" Elena asked, her voice carrying none of the disappointment Webb had anticipated. The simplicity of her acceptance caught him off guard, transforming his moment of triumph into something that felt oddly anticlimactic. He had expected argument, negotiation, or at least visible frustration. Instead, Elena had accepted the assignment with the same professional composure she brought to everything else. Webb recovered his composure and checked his tablet. Aircraft familiarization begins tomorrow morning. You'll have 2 weeks to get current on the systems before the Red Flag exercise begins. Red Flag was Nellis Air Force Base's premier training exercise, where squadrons from around the world gathered to practice large-scale air combat scenarios against sophisticated enemy simulations. Elena nodded and turned to leave, walking past the cluster of F-35 pilots whose attention had already moved on to more interesting topics. As she pushed through the glass doors back onto the flight line, she heard Morrison's voice carrying across the concrete. $20 says she can't even get that thing off the ground without help from maintenance. The bet was accepted with laughter that followed Elena across the tarmac. But Elena wasn't listening to their predictions. She was looking at the F-16 with the eyes of someone who understood that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones everyone else had written off as harmless. The aircraft waiting for her represented more than just an assignment. It was an opportunity to prove that experience, skill, and determination could overcome any technological disadvantage. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, casting shorter shadows across the flight line where the future of air combat sat gleaming in perfect formation. But Elena's attention was focused on the aircraft that represented the past, waiting patiently for someone who understood its true potential. The briefing room at Nellis buzzed with the controlled energy of pilots preparing for Red Flag 24-3. The premier air combat training exercise that would pit the most advanced fighter squadrons against simulated enemy forces, equipped with cutting-edge surface-to-air missiles and electronic warfare systems. Digital displays covered every wall, showing threat rings, engagement zones, and complex airspace management graphics that resembled a video game more than traditional military planning. Major Tom Reeves stood at the front of the room, laser pointer dancing across a three-dimensional holographic display that rotated slowly to show the exercise area from multiple angles. Reeves was the operations officer for the 64th Aggressor Squadron, responsible for designing training scenarios that pushed friendly forces to their limits while maintaining realistic threat presentations. His background included advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and systems analysis, credentials that reflected the modern Air Force's emphasis on technical expertise over traditional flying experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reeves began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from highly educated audiences. "Red Flag 24-3 represents the most sophisticated threat environment we've ever constructed. For training purposes, our opposition forces will employ S-400 surface-to-air missiles, advanced electronic attack platforms, and coordinated cyber warfare capabilities designed to replicate what we might face against peer competitors. The assembled pilots leaned forward in their seats, tablets and smartphones capturing every detail of the threat presentation. Captain Brad Stevens, the squadron's top F-35 pilot with more than 800 hours in type, raised his hand to ask about specific engagement parameters. Major, what's the expected detection range for friendly stealth platforms operating in the primary threat corridor? Reeves smiled and clicked to the next slide, which showed radar cross-section calculations for various aircraft types plotted against threat system capabilities. Excellent question. Brad, our modeling indicates that F-35s should maintain significant detection advantages at ranges beyond 40 nautical miles, assuming proper employment of low observable techniques and electronic countermeasures. The exercise is designed to validate these theoretical advantages under dynamic combat conditions. Lieutenant Morrison raised his own hand, his expression reflecting the confidence that came from flying the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Sir, what about legacy platforms? Are we expecting any F-16s or F-18s to participate in the opposition force? The question carried an undertone of amusement, as if the idea of older aircraft presenting credible threats was inherently ridiculous. Minimal legacy participation, Reeves replied, checking his notes on the podium. We have one F-16 assigned to the exercise for baseline comparison purposes, but it's not expected to significantly impact the tactical picture. The focus is on validating next-generation capabilities against sophisticated threats, not recreating historical scenarios. The dismissive tone reflected an institutional mindset that had developed over the past decade, as the F-35 program reached full operational capability. The Lightning II represented more than just technological advancement. It embodied a fundamental shift in how the Air Force approached air combat. Stealth, sensor fusion, and beyond visual range engagement had replaced the traditional emphasis on dogfighting skills and aircraft performance in close-quarters combat. This transformation was visible throughout the briefing room, where young pilots absorbed tactical doctrine that treated air-to-air combat as primarily an exercise in information management and systems integration. Their training emphasized situational awareness through data link networks, target identification through advanced sensors, and engagement through long-range precision weapons that eliminated the need for traditional air combat maneuvering. Philosophy made perfect sense from a technological standpoint. Why engage in risky close-quarters combat when stealth technology could provide first-shot opportunities at extended ranges? Why develop complex dogfighting skills when modern missiles could track targets through maneuvers that would have defeated earlier weapons? The F-35's sophisticated avionics could process threat information faster than any human pilot, providing targeting solutions and engagement recommendations that optimized kill probability while minimizing risk exposure. But this technological superiority had created blind spots that were invisible to pilots who had never operated without such advantages. The current generation of fighter pilots had trained exclusively on platforms with advanced radar warning receivers, comprehensive electronic warfare suites, and data link systems that provided real-time threat updates from multiple sources. They had never learned to fight without these technological crutches because they had never needed to. Elena understood these limitations because she had learned to fly in an environment where technology failed regularly and backup systems were luxuries rather than standard equipment. Her A-10 experience had taught her to navigate by landmark recognition when GPS signals were jammed, to identify targets through visual confirmation when sensors were degraded, and to engage threats at close range when standoff weapons were unavailable or inappropriate. These skills had seemed increasingly irrelevant as military technology advanced and combat scenarios shifted toward high altitude, long-range engagements against sophisticated opponents. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had been won through superior technology and overwhelming firepower, not through the kind of individual pilot skills that had characterized earlier conflicts. The institutional lesson was clear: invest in better technology rather than better training, because machines could be trusted to perform consistently, while humans remained unpredictable variables in complex systems. Red flag exercises reinforced this technological bias by designing scenarios that favored platforms with advanced capabilities. Threat presentations assumed that friendly forces would operate with full sensor coverage, complete electronic warfare protection, and coordinated support from a WACS, aircraft, and ground-based radar systems. The training was excellent preparation for conflicts where such support would be available, but provided little insight into how pilots might perform when stripped of their technological advantages. Colonel Webb understood this limitation intellectually, but dismissed it as irrelevant to current strategic requirements. The Air Force was not preparing to refight World War II or Vietnam. It was developing capabilities to defeat sophisticated opponents with advanced air defense systems and modern fighter aircraft. Training pilots to fight without technology was like teaching cavalry tactics to tank crews, potentially interesting from a historical perspective, but practically useless in contemporary warfare. This mindset extended throughout the squadron's approach to aircraft maintenance, mission planning, and pilot development. Older aircraft like the F-16 were maintained primarily for training purposes, providing adversary representation or serving as platforms for pilots transitioning between different aircraft types. They were not considered serious combat assets because their capabilities seemed primitive compared to fourth and fifth generation alternatives. The maintenance philosophy reflected these priorities. F-35s received priority scheduling for repairs and upgrades, with specialized technicians trained on the most advanced diagnostic equipment and replacement procedures. The lone F-16 received attention only when maintenance schedules permitted, often flying with minor system degradations that would ground more modern aircraft. This approach made economic sense given budget constraints and operational priorities. But it also meant that the F-16's actual performance capabilities remained largely theoretical. Elena had reviewed the aircraft's maintenance records. During her initial briefing with the crew chief, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had been maintaining F-16s for more than 15 years. Gonzalez knew the aircraft's quirks and limitations better than anyone, having kept it flying through multiple upgrade cycles and configuration changes that had gradually degraded its original performance characteristics. "Ma'am, this bird's got some personality," Gonzalez had explained during their walk-around inspection. "The radar's about 3 generations behind current standards. The electronic warfare suite was state-of-the-art in 1995, and the flight controls have more patches than original code. But the engines are solid, the airframe's got plenty of life left, and once you learn to work with the systems instead of against them, she do things that might surprise people." The sergeant's assessment revealed the fundamental gap between technological sophistication and operational effectiveness. The F-16 might lack the advanced sensors and stealth characteristics of modern fighters, but it retained performance advantages that newer aircraft had sacrificed in pursuit of multi-role capability and technological complexity. It was lighter, more maneuverable, and simpler to operate than platforms designed to accomplish multiple missions. Simultaneously, these advantages were invisible to pilots who had never learned to exploit them. The current generation of F-35 drivers relied on their aircraft systems to identify optimal engagement parameters, leaving little room for individual innovation or tactical creativity. They flew by the numbers because the numbers were generated by computers that processed more information than any human could manage independently. Elena's generation had learned to supplement technological capabilities with personal judgment. and tactical intuition developed through thousands of hours in challenging environments. They understood that technology provided tools rather than solutions, and that the most effective employment of any weapon system required human insight that couldn't be programmed or automated. The red flag exercise would test these competing philosophies under conditions designed to favor technological superiority. But Elena suspected that the test designers had overlooked variables that could disrupt their carefully calculated scenarios. Combat had a way of revealing assumptions that seemed obvious until they proved catastrophically wrong. The pre-dawn air at Nellis carried the distinctive chill of high desert mornings, temperature dropping into the 50s despite the promise of triple-digit heat that would arrive with the climbing sun. Elena walked across the empty flight line at 0430 hours, her flight bag slung over one shoulder and a thermos of black coffee steaming in the cool air. The base was quiet except for the distant hum of ground support equipment and the occasional rumble of cargo aircraft on approach to the parallel runway. Tail number 841234 sat in its assigned parking spot like a forgotten relic, separated from the gleaming F-35s by both physical distance and what seemed like geological epochs of technological development. In the harsh glare of the maintenance area's overhead lighting, the F-16 looked every one of its 37 years. Paint had faded along the leading edges where decades of high-speed flight had abraded the surfaces. Access panels bore the scuff marks and tool scratches that accumulated over countless maintenance cycles. The aircraft's overall appearance suggested a machine that had been used hard and maintained adequately, but never pampered. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez emerged from beneath the aircraft's belly, wiping hydraulic fluid from her hands with a stained rag. Her olive-green coveralls bore the patches and stains that marked career maintenance personnel, and her expression carried the particular mix of pride and exasperation that came from keeping aging equipment operational despite budget constraints and competing priorities. "Morning, Captain," Gonzalez said, straightening to her full height and unconsciously shifting into the formal posture that military protocol demanded when addressing officers. "I've got her ready for your familiarization flight, but there are a few things you should know before you strap in." Elena set her flight bag on the ground and pulled out a worn notebook that contained her personal aircraft inspection checklist, developed over thousands of hours in multiple aircraft types. Gonzalez gestured toward the aircraft's nose, where the radar antenna was visible through the transparent radome. "The AN APG-68 radar is 3 generations behind what you'll find in the F-35s. But it's been upgraded with synthetic aperture mapping and improved clutter rejection. Range is limited to about 50 nautical miles for fighter-sized targets, and the resolution isn't going to win any awards, but it's reliable and it doesn't give away your position to every electronic warfare system within 100 miles. The sergeant's assessment revealed the first hint of the F-16's hidden advantages. While the F-35's NAPG-81 radar provided superior detection ranges and target discrimination, it also operated on frequencies and with power levels that made it highly visible to sophisticated electronic warfare systems. The older F-16 radar operated more quietly, with emission characteristics that were harder to detect and classify by enemy systems designed to identify modern threats. Elena ran her hand along the aircraft's leading edge, feeling the slight roughness were countless. Hours of high-speed flight had abraded the original smooth finish. The sensation was familiar from her A-10 experience, where aircraft showed their history through accumulated wear patterns that told stories of missions and maintenance cycles. "What about the flight controls?" she asked, knowing that this was where the real differences between generations would become apparent. "Analog fly-by-wire with digital backup," Gonzalez replied, opening an access panel to reveal the complex maze of wiring and hydraulic lines that kept the aircraft controllable. "No flight envelope protection like the newer birds have, which means you can exceed design limits if you're not careful." But it also means you can push the aircraft beyond what the computer thinks is possible when you need to. The distinction was crucial but subtle. Modern fighters incorporated flight control systems that prevented pilots from exceeding predetermined safety parameters, ensuring that aircraft remained within tested flight envelopes even under extreme maneuvering conditions. These systems prevented accidents and reduced training requirements, but they also imposed limitations that could prove critical in unexpected situations. Elena's A-10 experience had taught her to appreciate aircraft that responded directly to pilot inputs without computer intervention. The Warthog's manual flight controls had required constant attention and physical strength, but they had also provided immediate feedback about aircraft performance and environmental conditions that automated systems filtered out in the interest of pilot workload reduction. The F-16's flight control philosophy represented a middle ground between manual and automated systems. The fly-by-wire technology provided stability augmentation and control response shaping, but it preserved the direct connection between pilot inputs and aircraft response that characterized true fighter aircraft. Elena suspected that this distinction would prove more significant than the F-35 pilots realized. Gonzalez led Elena around the aircraft's perimeter, pointing out systems and capabilities that didn't appear in the standard technical manuals. The previous pilot modified the defensive systems integration, she explained, indicating a series of additional antennas and black boxes that had been installed during various upgrade cycles. Captain Rodriguez was an electronic warfare specialist before he transferred to fighters, and he spent a lot of time working with the avionics guys to optimize the threat warning and countermeasure systems. The modifications were subtle but potentially game-changing. Where F-35 pilots relied on automated threat identification and response systems, the F-16's enhanced defensive suite required active pilot management but provided more detailed information about threat characteristics and engagement parameters. Elena recognized the philosophy behind these modifications. Trust pilots to make tactical decisions based on complete information rather than limiting them to predetermined response options. As the sun began to rise over the mountains east of Las Vegas, casting long shadows across the flight line, Elena climbed into the F-16's cockpit for her first detailed examination of the aircraft's capabilities. The interior was cramped compared to modern standards, with instruments and controls packed into every available space, according to design philosophies that prioritized functionality over ergonomics. But Elena felt immediately at home in the environment, recognizing the direct relationship between pilot and machine that had been lost in more automated aircraft. The heads-up display provided basic flight information and targeting symbology, but it lacked the comprehensive sensor fusion and situational awareness displays that F-35 pilots took for granted. Elena would need to build her tactical picture through manual correlation of multiple information sources, a skill that had been largely eliminated from modern pilot training programs, but which remains second nature to her generation of combat pilots. The engine start sequence proceeded smoothly, with the Pratt & Whitney F100 turbofan spooling up to idle with the distinctive whine that marked this particular power plant. Elena felt the subtle vibrations and heard the characteristic sounds that indicated normal engine operation, sensory inputs that had been dampened or eliminated in newer aircraft designed for pilot comfort rather than direct machine interface. The taxi phase, Elena began to understand why her colleagues had dismissed the F-16 as obsolete. The aircraft required constant attention and active pilot input for basic operations that were automated in modern fighters. Navigation required manual waypoint entry and course corrections. Communications demanded individual frequency management rather than automated networking. Threat monitoring involved interpreting multiple discrete systems rather than relying on integrated displays. But Elena recognized these apparent disadvantages as potential strengths in the right tactical environment. The F-16 systems operated independently, meaning that electronic warfare attacks or system failures that could cripple integrated platforms would leave the Fighting Falcon with degraded, but still functional capabilities. The manual workload that intimidated younger pilots was manageable for someone with Elena's experience, and it provided tactical flexibility that automated systems couldn't match. As she taxied toward the runway for her first training flight, Elena began to formulate ideas about how the F-16's characteristics might be exploited in ways that more modern aircraft couldn't duplicate. The aircraft was smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable than the F-35. It generated less heat signature, radiated fewer electronic emissions, and presented a smaller radar cross-section than its larger, more sophisticated counterparts. Most importantly, the F-16 could operate effectively in environments where modern fighters might struggle. Its simpler systems were less vulnerable to cyber warfare and electronic attack. Its manual flight controls provided options for extreme maneuvering that computer-limited aircraft couldn't access. Its reduced electronic signature made it harder to detect and track by sophisticated enemy systems designed to counter known threats. Elena realized that Colonel Webb and the other F-35 pilots had made a fundamental error in their assessment of the F-16's capabilities. They had measured the aircraft against modern standards and found it lacking, but they had failed to consider scenarios where those modern capabilities might become liabilities rather than advantages. In their eagerness to embrace technological superiority, they had forgotten that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who fought by different rules entirely. The control tower cleared Elena for takeoff, and she advanced the throttle to military power, feeling the F-16 accelerate down the runway with an eagerness that modern fighters had sacrificed in pursuit of other capabilities. As the aircraft lifted off into the clear Nevada morning, Elena smiled with the recognition that she had been given exactly the weapon she needed to prove a point that her colleagues were about to learn the hard way. The flight line at Nellis resembled a technology showcase as Elena taxied back from her third training sortie in the F-16, passing rows of F-35 Lightning IIs that gleamed like expensive jewelry under the afternoon sun. Ground crews swarmed around the modern fighters with the urgency of pit crews, uploading mission data, checking weapon systems, and preparing for the complex training scenarios that would validate their cutting-edge capabilities. Elena's aircraft drew no such attention. The F-16 rolled to its parking spot in relative isolation, where Staff Sergeant Gonzalez waited with a basic post-flight inspection checklist and none of the sophisticated diagnostic equipment that serviced the newer aircraft. The contrast was deliberate and unmistakable, a visual reminder of where the aging fighter ranked in the squadron's priorities. As Elena shut down the engine and began her post-flight procedures, Lieutenant Morrison and his wingman, Lieutenant Chun, walked past her aircraft on their way to the briefing room. Morrison carried his helmet bag with the casual swagger that marked F-35 pilots, while Chun scrolled through mission data on her tablet, reviewing the day's training results with the focused intensity that characterized the younger generation of aviators. "Look at that," Morrison said, nodding toward Elena's F-16 with barely concealed amusement. "Grandma's still playing with her antique. I heard she actually thinks that thing could be competitive in a modern exercise." Chun glanced up from her tablet, taking in the weathered appearance of the older aircraft with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating museum pieces. "The maintenance guys told me it takes twice as long to prep that bird for flight as it does an F-35. All those manual systems and analog displays. Like flying a calculator when everyone else has smartphones." Their conversation carried across the tarmac with the casual cruelty that marked young professionals who had never experienced failure or humiliation. Elena heard every word but continued her shutdown checklist with the methodical precision that had become second nature over 2 decades of flying. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only encouraged more elaborate displays of disrespect. Inside the Squadron Operations Center, the day's training results were being analyzed by a team of intelligence specialists who translated raw mission data into comprehensive performance assessments. Captain Stevens stood before a large display screen that showed track files and engagement results from the afternoon's air-to-air exercise, gesturing at specific data points while explaining tactical developments to the assembled pilots. Blue Force achieved first shot opportunities in 73% of engagements. Stevens reported, his voice carrying the confidence that came from flying the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. F-35 sensor fusion provided target identification at ranges exceeding 40 nautical miles, with successful beyond visual range kills in every scenario where proper engagement parameters were maintained. The assembled pilots nodded approvingly at results that confirmed their technological superiority and validated their training methods. Major Reeves stood near the back of the room, reviewing his own tablet computer while monitoring the debrief session. As the exercise director, he was responsible for ensuring that training scenarios provided realistic challenges while maintaining safety parameters that prevented accidents or equipment damage. The F-35 pilot's performance had been exemplary by every measurable standard, demonstrating exactly the kind of technological dominance that red flag exercises were designed to develop and refine. Reeves had noticed something in the raw data that didn't quite fit the overall narrative of technological superiority. During several training scenarios, the F-16 had appeared on radar screens in positions that shouldn't have been possible, given its supposed performance limitations. The aircraft had somehow managed to penetrate defensive formations and achieve firing positions against targets that should have detected and engaged it long before it became a threat. When Reeves mentioned these anomalies to Colonel Webb, the squadron commander had dismissed them with the casual indifference that marked his attitude toward anything involving legacy equipment. "Probably a radar glitch or a range instrumentation error," Webb had said without looking up from his own paperwork. That F-16 couldn't threaten a modern fighter in any realistic scenario. Elena's just getting lucky with simulator limitations and artificial constraints that don't reflect real-world capabilities. The dismissal was automatic and complete, reflecting institutional biases that had become so deeply embedded that contradictory evidence was simply filtered out rather than analyzed. Webb's assessment made perfect sense from his perspective. How could a 37-year-old aircraft with analog systems pose any credible threat to fighters equipped with the most advanced sensors and weapons ever developed? This mindset extended throughout the squadron's approach to exercise planning and tactical development. Training scenarios were designed around the assumption that F-35 capabilities would provide decisive advantages in any engagement, with opposition forces represented by predictable threat presentations that validated predetermined tactical solutions. The possibility that unconventional approaches might disrupt these carefully orchestrated scenarios was considered so remote as to be irrelevant. Elena became aware of this institutional dismissal during her first formal briefing with the Red Flag exercise planners who had summoned her to discuss her role in the upcoming training scenarios. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room filled with junior officers who treated her presence as a bureaucratic requirement rather than a tactical consultation. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the lead exercise planner, opened a thick folder containing Elena's assignment details while maintaining the professional courtesy that military protocol demanded. "Captain Vasquez, your F-16 will be operating in support of the main exercise objectives, providing baseline performance data, and serving as a control group for advanced capabilities assessment." Walsh explained in the tone typically reserved for explaining simple concepts to confused subordinates. The assignment was diplomatically worded, but transparently marginal. Elena would be permitted to participate in training scenarios, but only in carefully controlled situations that wouldn't interfere with the primary training objectives. Her aircraft would serve as a flying data point rather than a genuine participant, providing comparative performance metrics that would highlight the superiority of modern systems. Walsh continued reading from the folder with the mechanical precision of someone reciting predetermined talking points. Your mission parameters will be limited to defensive counter-air scenarios at medium altitudes, with engagement restrictions designed to prevent interference with primary training objectives. You'll be operating under positive control from a WACS aircraft, with predetermined routing that keeps you clear of the main exercise areas. Elena recognized the assignment for what it was, a carefully constructed way to include her in the exercise, while ensuring that she remained irrelevant to any meaningful outcomes. The flight restrictions and operational limitations would prevent her from demonstrating any capabilities that might challenge the established narrative about F-35 superiority. She would be allowed to fly, but only within boundaries that guaranteed her ineffectiveness. The most insulting aspect of the assignment was its transparency. Walsh and her planning team hadn't even bothered to disguise their intentions behind plausible tactical requirements. They were treating Elena like a dangerous amateur who needed to be managed and contained, rather than a combat veteran with more experience than their entire planning team combined. After the briefing, Elena walked across the base to the dining facility where she encountered the social consequences of her marginalized status. The F-35 pilots occupied their usual tables near the windows, engaged in animated discussions about upcoming training scenarios and technical capabilities. Their conversations carried the enthusiasm of professionals who loved their work and respected each other's expertise. Elena's arrival created a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Conversations didn't stop, but they became more guarded, with occasional glances in her direction that carried mixtures of pity and amusement. She had become the squadron's charity case, the aging pilot who was being humored rather than respected, tolerated rather than valued. Lieutenant Morrison made a show of greeting Elena with exaggerated politeness as she passed his table. "Hey, Captain, how's the museum piece treating you? Getting used to flying without a computer to hold your hand?" The question was delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, carrying the particular brand of cruelty that passed for humor among people who had never experienced genuine adversity. Elena's response was professionally neutral, acknowledging the comment without engaging in the confrontation that Morrison obviously hoped to provoke. But she could feel the weight of collective judgment settling around her like a suffocating blanket. Every pilot in the dining facility understood that she had been assigned to obsolete equipment because she herself was considered obsolete, a relic from an earlier era who lacked the technical sophistication to operate modern fighters. The institutional message was clear and unambiguous. Elena's experience and combat record were interesting historical footnotes, but they had no relevance to contemporary air warfare. The Air Force had moved beyond the kind of individual pilot skills that had characterized earlier conflicts, embracing technological solutions that eliminated human variables in favor of predictable, measurable outcomes. Elena finished her meal in relative silence, surrounded by conversations that excluded her as completely as if she had been invisible. The social isolation was more painful than the professional marginalization because it reflected personal judgments rather than institutional policies. Her colleagues didn't just consider her equipment obsolete. They considered her obsolete as well, but Elena carried within her the knowledge that had sustained her through 2 decades of combat operations. The most dangerous opponents were often the ones that others underestimated. The F-35 pilots' confidence in their technological superiority was about to be tested in ways that their training had never prepared them for, and Elena intended to provide that test personally. Colonel Webb stood behind his desk in the squadron commander's office, reviewing a stack of paperwork that seemed to grow larger each day as Red Flag 24-3 approached its final preparation phase. The morning sunlight streaming through his window illuminated commendations and photographs from his own F-35 career, including a prominent display featuring his graduation from the first operational Lightning II training class at Eglin Air Force Base. His expression carried the focused intensity of someone managing multiple complex priorities under demanding timelines. Elena knocked twice on the doorframe before entering, carrying a folder containing her detailed analysis of the F-16's actual capabilities versus the limitations imposed by her current mission parameters. She had spent the previous evening reviewing aircraft performance data, weapons employment procedures, and tactical options that weren't being considered in the exercise planning process. Her research had revealed opportunities that the F-35 pilots were overlooking, blind spots in their technological superiority that could be exploited by someone who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of older systems. "Sir, I'd like to request a modification to my red flag mission parameters," Elena began, keeping her voice professionally neutral while maintaining the military courtesy that protocol demanded. "I believe the current assignment doesn't fully utilize the F-16's capabilities or provide realistic training value for the exercise scenarios." Webb looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone who had been interrupted during important work to discuss trivial administrative details. Webb gestured for Elena to take a seat in one of the metal chairs positioned in front of his desk, but his body language suggested that he expected this to be a brief conversation. "What kind of modifications are you thinking about, Captain?" he asked, his tone carrying the patient condescension that superior officers sometimes used when dealing with subordinates who didn't understand their limitations. Elena opened her folder and pulled out a carefully prepared briefing sheet that outlined specific tactical scenarios where the F-16 could provide genuine opposition force training for the F-35 pilots. "Sir, the current exercise parameters restrict my aircraft to medium-altitude defensive scenarios under positive AWACS control. I'd like to propose unrestricted air-to-air engagements at multiple altitude bands, with the freedom to employ full-spectrum tactical approaches that would test F-35 capabilities under more realistic conditions." The request was reasonable and well-researched, backed by detailed analysis that demonstrated how such modifications would enhance training value for all participants. Elena had identified specific scenarios where the F-16's characteristics might provide learning opportunities that couldn't be replicated through conventional opposition force presentations. But Webb's response revealed that reasonableness wasn't the primary consideration in exercise planning decisions. "Captain, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the exercise scenarios have been carefully designed by specialists with advanced degrees in systems analysis and threat assessment," Webb replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who didn't expect his decisions to be questioned by subordinates. "Your F-16 assignment serves important purposes within the established parameters. We're not going to redesign the entire exercise structure to accommodate legacy equipment limitations." Elena pressed forward despite the obvious resistance, opening her folder to reveal performance comparisons that challenged some of Webb's fundamental assumptions about technological superiority. "Sir, I believe there are gaps in the current threat presentation that the F-16 could address. The exercise focuses on known threat characteristics, but it doesn't account for opponents who might employ unconventional tactics or operate outside expected parameters." Webb's expression shifted from patient tolerance to something approaching irritation as Elena continued her presentation. He had allocated 15 minutes for this meeting, expecting to provide routine reassurance to a marginalized pilot who needed to feel included in important operations. Instead, Elena was questioning the technical expertise of his planning staff and suggesting that their sophisticated analysis might be incomplete. "Captain Vasquez," Webb said, his voice taking on the edge that marked military authority when it was being challenged, The red flag planning process involves input from some of the finest tactical minds in the Air Force. We have PhD-level analysts who have studied these scenarios for months using the most advanced modeling and simulation capabilities available. I don't think a single F-16 pilot is going to identify shortcomings that escape their attention. The dismissal was complete and professionally devastating, delivered with the kind of institutional authority that ended conversations rather than encouraging further discussion. Webb had essentially told Elena that her experience, combat record, and tactical insights were irrelevant compared to the theoretical knowledge possessed by staff officers who had never flown combat missions. The message was clear: stay in your assigned role and don't presume to understand strategic decisions that exceeded her level of expertise. Elena attempted one final approach. Pulling out incident reports from recent training exercises were unexpected. Tactical developments had disrupted carefully planned scenarios. Sir, there have been cases where opposition forces achieved results that weren't predicted by the modeling systems. I think there's value in testing F-35 capabilities against approaches that fall outside conventional threat presentations. Webb stood up behind his desk, a gesture that indicated the meeting was over, regardless of Elena's remaining arguments. Captain, your concerns are noted, but the exercise parameters are final. Your mission assignment provides important baseline data within a carefully controlled environment. That's where you can make your most valuable contribution to this exercise. The phrase "most valuable contribution" carried unmistakable implications about Elena's limited role in contemporary air operations. She was being told, politely but firmly, that her purpose was to serve as a data point rather than a tactical participant. The F-16's role in Red Flag 24-3 would be to highlight F-35 superiority through direct comparison, demonstrating the overwhelming advantages that modern technology provided over legacy systems. After Elena left Webb's office, the colonel immediately placed a call to Major Reeves, the exercise planning officer who had raised earlier questions about anomalous radar contacts involving the F-16. Webb's message was direct and unambiguous. Elena's participation needed to be managed more carefully to prevent any disruptions to the primary training objectives. Tom, I need you to tighten the parameters on that F-16 assignment, Webb said, his voice carrying the authority of someone issuing orders rather than making suggestions. Captain Vasquez seems to have some misguided ideas about her role in this exercise. I want her kept on a short leash with explicit altitude restrictions, predetermined routing, and positive control from start to finish. Reeves understood the implications immediately. Elena was being treated as a potential problem rather than a training asset, someone who needed to be contained rather than utilized. The additional restrictions would ensure that her aircraft remained irrelevant to exercise outcomes while still allowing the Air Force to claim that legacy platforms had been included in the training scenarios. The institutional response extended beyond individual decision-making to encompass broader policies that reflected the Air Force's commitment to technological superiority over traditional pilot skills. Budget allocations, maintenance priorities, and training time were all being directed toward platforms and capabilities that represented the future of air warfare rather than artifacts from earlier conflicts. Elena discovered the extent of this institutional resistance when she attempted to schedule additional training time to optimize her F-16's performance for the upcoming exercise. The maintenance scheduler, Master Sergeant Kevin Thompson, explained apologetically that priority scheduling belonged to F-35 operations, with legacy aircraft receiving attention only when resources permitted. Ma'am, I understand what you're trying to accomplish, but the F-35s have scheduled maintenance windows that can't be moved, Thompson explained while reviewing his computer terminal. Your bird gets whatever time slots are left over, and frankly, there aren't many of those. During exercise preparation periods, The scheduling limitations meant that Elena would enter red flag 24-3 with minimal preparation, time, and suboptimal aircraft configuration. Similar barriers appeared throughout the support structure that sustained flight, operations, weapons loading. Crews had limited experience with F-16 systems, slowing turnaround times and creating scheduling conflicts with higher priority aircraft. Intelligence briefings focused on threats and scenarios relevant to F-35 operations with minimal attention to tactical challenges that might affect legacy platforms. Even basic administrative support reflected the institutional bias toward modern systems over traditional capabilities. The cumulative effect of these obstacles was to isolate Elena professionally and operationally, ensuring that her participation in red flag 24-3 would be marginal regardless of her personal capabilities or tactical insights. The system had identified her as a potential disruption to established narratives about technological superiority, and it was responding with bureaucratic efficiency to minimize any challenges she might present. Elena recognized these barriers for what they were: institutional resistance to information that didn't fit predetermined conclusions about air warfare evolution. The Air Force had invested billions of dollars and decades of planning in the transition to fifth-generation fighters, and it couldn't afford to acknowledge that earlier platforms might retain relevant capabilities under specific circumstances. But Elena also understood that bureaucratic obstacles could sometimes create opportunities for those patient enough to work around them rather than through them. The restrictions and limitations being imposed on her F-16 participation might actually provide tactical advantages that her opponents wouldn't recognize until it was too late to respond effectively. The stage was being set for a confrontation between institutional certainty and individual expertise, between technological confidence and combat experience. Elena had been systematically marginalized and constrained, but she had also been underestimated in ways that might prove more dangerous to her opponents than to herself. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Elena's quarters at exactly 04:00, jerking her awake from a restless sleep filled with dreams of aerial combat scenarios that ended badly. She had been sleeping poorly for the past week, her mind churning through tactical possibilities and equipment limitations while her body demanded rest that wouldn't come. The stress of constant professional isolation was taking its toll in ways that she had never experienced during actual combat deployments. Elena sat on the edge of her narrow military-issue bed, running her hands through her disheveled hair as she tried to shake off the lingering effects of another night spent rehearsing aerial engagements in her subconscious. The dreams had been uncomfortably specific, featuring her F-16 being systematically outmaneuvered and destroyed by F-35s whose pilots seemed to anticipate her every tactical decision. Each engagement had ended with the same result: her aircraft burning in the desert while younger pilots celebrated their inevitable victory over obsolete opposition. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman who looked older than her 42 years, with stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months earlier and gray streaks in her hair that seemed to multiply daily. Elena studied her reflection with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating her own deteriorating condition, recognizing symptoms of chronic stress that she had observed in younger pilots struggling to adapt to combat pressures. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was experiencing psychological strain from a peacetime training exercise while she had remained calm during actual life or death missions. During her morning shower, Elena found herself questioning decisions that had seemed obvious just days earlier. Perhaps Webb and his staff were correct in their assessment of the F-16's limitations. Perhaps her combat experience was indeed irrelevant to contemporary air warfare, a collection of outdated skills that had no application to conflicts involving sophisticated opponents with advanced technology. The possibility that she was clinging to professional identity based on achievements that no Longer mattered gnawed at her confidence like acid eating through metal. The walk to the dining facility reinforced her growing sense of professional isolation. Groups of F-35 pilots moved past her with the easy camaraderie of colleagues who shared common experiences and mutual respect. Their conversations buzzed with technical details about sensor fusion, threat libraries, and engagement algorithms. That represented knowledge Elena had never acquired because her aircraft lacked such capabilities. She began to feel like a tourist in her own profession, observing developments that had left her behind without her realizing it. "Lieutenant," Morrison's voice carried across the dining facility as Elena approached the serving line, loud enough to ensure that his comments reached her ears. "I heard Grandma Vasquez is still trying to convince Colonel Webb that her antique can compete with real fighters," he said to Lieutenant Chun, who was scrolling through mission data on her tablet. "Probably thinks 20-year-old tactics still work against modern systems." Chun glanced up from her screen with the dismissive expression of someone considering obviously ridiculous propositions. "My flight instructor at the academy used to tell stories about pilots like that. Old-timers who couldn't accept that technology had made their experience irrelevant. They'd keep flying outdated aircraft and claiming they could outfight newer systems until reality proved them wrong." The conversation continued with increasingly elaborate speculation about Elena's psychological state and professional competence, delivered with the casual cruelty that marked young people who had never experienced failure or humiliation. Elena collected her breakfast tray and found an isolated table near the window, trying to ignore the laughter that followed Morrison's increasingly creative descriptions of her supposed illusions. But the mockery was having its intended effect. Elena found herself analyzing every aspect of her recent performance, searching for evidence that might support her critics' assessment of her declining capabilities. Had she been making tactical errors during training flights? Were her reaction times slower than they had been 5 years earlier? Was she compensating for decreased physical abilities by clinging to equipment that masked her limitations? The questions multiplied during her pre-flight briefing for a routine training mission that had been scheduled to test the F-16's defensive systems against simulated electronic warfare attacks. Major Reeves conducted the briefing with the perfunctory efficiency of someone fulfilling administrative requirements rather than preparing for meaningful training. His presentation focused on procedural compliance and safety parameters rather than tactical objectives, reinforcing Elena's growing suspicion that her flights were considered practice sessions rather than serious military exercises. "Captain Vasquez, your mission today is primarily systems familiarization with secondary objectives involving baseline performance documentation," Reeves explained while consulting his tablet rather than making eye contact. "You'll be operating in restricted airspace under positive control from range safety, with predetermined routing that keeps you clear of F-35 training operations." Elena recognized the assignment for what it was: busy work designed to keep her occupied while more important training took place elsewhere. The mission parameters were so restrictive, they would prevent any meaningful evaluation of aircraft or pilot capabilities, reducing her flight to an expensive form of recreational aviation. She could have accomplished the same training objectives in a flight simulator without consuming fuel or aircraft maintenance hours. During the mission itself, Elena discovered that her growing self-doubt was affecting her performance in subtle but measurable ways. Her normally precise aircraft handling felt awkward and uncertain, as if she was second-guessing muscle memory that had been developed over thousands of hours of flight time. Radio communications that had once been crisp and professional became hesitant and overly formal, reflecting her decreased confidence in her own judgment and decision-making abilities. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The F-16 systems, which had seemed familiar and manageable during her initial familiarization flights, now felt primitive and limiting compared to the F-35 capabilities that dominated every professional conversation around her. The analog displays that had once provided clear information now seemed cluttered and difficult to interpret. The manual flight controls that had offered precise response now felt sluggish and unresponsive, compared to the fly-by-wire systems that younger pilots described with obvious enthusiasm. Most disturbing was Elena's growing awareness that she was becoming exactly what her critics claimed she was, an aging pilot struggling to maintain relevance in a profession that had moved beyond her capabilities. The realization arrived with the force of physical impact, leaving her feeling hollowed out and professionally directionless. Perhaps the institutional consensus about her obsolescence was correct, and her resistance to that assessment was merely stubborn denial of obvious reality. After landing, Elena sat in the F-16's cockpit for several additional minutes, going through post-flight procedures with mechanical precision while her mind wrestled with fundamental questions about her future in military aviation. The aircraft that had seemed like an opportunity to prove herself now felt like evidence of her professional decline, a museum piece assigned to someone who belonged in the same historical category. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez appeared at the aircraft's side with post-flight inspection checklists, but she seemed to sense Elena's emotional state and kept her technical questions brief and focused. The sergeant's professional courtesy felt like pity, another reminder that Elena had become an object of concern rather than respect among the maintenance personnel who kept aircraft operational. The walk back to the Squadron Operations Center became an exercise in psychological endurance as Elena forced herself to maintain military bearing while struggling with doubts that seemed to multiply with each step. Other pilots moved past her with purpose and confidence, engaged in conversations about upcoming missions and tactical developments that didn't include her input or perspective. She had become a spectator in her own profession, watching from the sidelines while younger colleagues accomplished the work she had once considered her primary purpose in life. Inside her quarters that evening, Elena spread her personal flight records across the small desk, searching for evidence that might contradict her growing certainty that her best days as a pilot were behind her. The commendations and performance evaluations told the story of a successful career built on competence and dedication, but they all dated from conflicts and assignments that seemed increasingly irrelevant to contemporary military requirements. Documentation of her achievements felt like archaeological artifacts from a different era, interesting from a historical perspective, but lacking practical application to current challenges. Elena began to understand how career military personnel felt when technological changes made their expertise obsolete, leaving them professionally stranded in organizations that no longer valued their contributions. The doubt that had begun as a whisper was becoming a roar, drowning out the confidence that had sustained her through 2 decades of challenging assignments. Elena was beginning to believe that everyone else might be right about her limitations, and that her resistance to institutional assessment was merely the stubborn pride of someone who couldn't accept that her time had passed. Elena stood in the maintenance hangar at 0530 hours, 3 days before red flag 24-3 would commence, watching Staff Sergeant Gonzalez complete the final systems checks on tail number 841234. The fluorescent overhead lighting cast harsh shadows across the aircraft's weathered surfaces, highlighting every rivet line and access panel that marked its decades of operational service. Elena had arrived early not because maintenance required her presence, but because she needed to make a decision that would define the remainder of her military career. The previous evening's Squadron briefing had confirmed her worst fears about her assigned role in the exercise. Major Reeves had presented the final mission parameters with the bureaucratic precision of someone reading predetermined talking points, outlining restrictions that would effectively neutralize any possibility of meaningful participation. Elena would be flying predetermined routes at specified altitudes under constant positive control, serving as little more than a flying data point in scenarios designed to validate F-35 superiority, but something had shifted during the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn, crystallizing Elena's resolve in ways that surprised her with their clarity and intensity. The doubt and self-recrimination that had plagued her for weeks suddenly transformed into cold determination, fueled by the recognition that she had been allowing others to define her capabilities based on their prejudices rather than objective evidence. She was tired of apologizing for her experience and tired of accepting limitations imposed by people who had never tested themselves against genuine adversity. Elena approached Gonzalez with a purposefulness that the sergeant recognized immediately. "I need to understand this aircraft's absolute performance limits," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority that came from making irrevocable decisions. "Not the book values or the official specifications. I need to know what this machine can actually do when pushed beyond normal parameters." Gonzalez set down her tools and studied Elena's expression, recognizing the intensity that marked pilots who had moved beyond routine training into something more serious. "Ma'am, are you asking about emergency procedures or combat employment?" The question carried implications that both women understood without explicit discussion. "I'm asking about capabilities that aren't covered in standard training syllabi," Elena replied, choosing her words carefully to avoid technical violations of any orders or regulations. "I want to know what modifications and techniques might optimize performance for specific tactical scenarios." Gonzalez nodded slowly, understanding that Elena was requesting information that fell into gray areas between official procedures and practical knowledge accumulated through years of hands-on experience. Over the next 2 hours, Gonzalez provided Elena with detailed briefings on aircraft systems modifications, performance optimization techniques, and employment procedures that existed outside normal training curricula. The F-16's flight control software could be adjusted to provide more aggressive response characteristics. The radar system could be operated in non-standard modes that traded detection range for reduced emission signatures. The electronic warfare suite could be programmed with custom threat libraries that provided more detailed information about specific enemy systems. Most importantly, Gonzalez explained how previous pilots had exploited the F-16's fundamental design characteristics to achieve performance levels that exceeded official specifications. The aircraft's lightweight and powerful engine provided thrust-to-weight ratios that enabled sustained vertical climbs and extreme angle of attack maneuvers that heavier fighters couldn't match. Its small size and relatively clean radar cross-section made it difficult to detect and track at ranges where larger aircraft would be clearly visible to sophisticated sensors. Elena absorbed this information with the focused intensity of someone preparing for examinations that would determine her professional future. She took detailed notes on system settings, tactical procedures, and performance parameters that weren't covered in standard technical manuals. Each piece of information represented potential advantages that could be exploited by someone willing to operate outside conventional parameters and accept the risks that came with pushing equipment beyond normal limits. The following day, Elena requested permission to conduct additional familiarization flights, ostensibly to ensure her proficiency with F-16 systems before the exercise began. Colonel Webb approved the request with the indifferent efficiency of someone processing routine administrative paperwork, apparently viewing Elena's preparation as harmless busy work that wouldn't affect more important operations. Elena used these flights to test the aircraft modifications and techniques that Gonzalez had described, carefully documenting performance characteristics and system responses under various flight conditions. She discovered that the F-16 was capable of significantly better performance than its official specifications suggested, particularly in areas that directly affected air-to-air combat effectiveness. The aircraft could climb faster, turn tighter and accelerate more rapidly than newer fighters that had sacrificed pure performance for multi-role capability and advanced avionics. More importantly, Elena began to understand how these performance advantages could be employed tactically against opponents who expected to encounter conventional threats operating within predictable parameters. The F-35 pilots had trained exclusively against known opposition systems with well-documented capabilities and standard employment procedures. They had never encountered an opponent willing to sacrifice safety margins and operational procedures to achieve tactical surprise. Elena spent her evenings studying intelligence reports about F-35 capabilities and limitations, identifying potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone operating with different tactical assumptions. The Lightning II stealth characteristics were optimized for specific threat frequencies and engagement ranges. Its sensor fusion systems provided overwhelming advantages against conventional opponents, but might struggle to process information about targets that didn't conform to programmed threat libraries. Most significantly, Elena realized that the F-35 pilots' reliance on automated systems and beyond visual range engagements had created blind spots in their training that could be exploited through close-quarters combat tactics. The younger pilots had never learned to fight without technological advantages because they had never needed to. Their entire tactical philosophy was built around maintaining standoff distances and employing superior sensors to achieve first-shot opportunities. Elena's plan began to coalesce around the recognition that her opponents' greatest strength might also be their greatest weakness. The F-35 pilots were supremely confident in their technological superiority, but that confidence was based on assumptions about how air combat should be conducted rather than how it might be conducted by someone willing to break conventional rules. The night before Red Flag 24-3 commenced, Elena made final preparations that went beyond normal pre-flight procedures. She programmed custom settings into the F-16's defensive systems, loaded specialized software configurations that Gonzalez had helped her develop, and reviewed tactical procedures that hadn't been employed in training exercises for more than a decade. Each modification and preparation represented conscious decisions to operate outside standard parameters in pursuit of tactical advantages that others had overlooked. Elena understood that she was taking personal and professional risks that could end her military career if her approaches proved unsuccessful or violated regulations in ways that couldn't be justified by results. But she also recognized that her current trajectory led toward inevitable professional irrelevance, regardless of how carefully she followed established procedures. The time for caution and deference had passed, replaced by the cold calculation that sometimes desperate circumstances required. Desperate measures. As she secured her aircraft and walked across the darkened flight line toward her quarters, Elena carried herself with the purposefulness of someone who had moved beyond doubt into action. Tomorrow would bring the opportunity to prove that experience, determination, and tactical innovation could overcome technological superiority when employed by someone who understood that the most dangerous opponents were those who refused to fight by the rules that others considered inviolable. Red Flag 24-3 commenced at 0630 hours, with the thunderous roar of afterburners as 24 F-35 Lightning IIs launched from Nellis Air Force Base into the crystal-clear Nevada morning. The formation climbed rapidly toward their assigned patrol sectors, their pilots confident in their technological superiority and prepared for training scenarios that would validate months of preparation and tactical development. Elena's F-16 lifted off 30 minutes later, alone and unnoticed, relegated to a peripheral role that everyone expected would provide little more than background noise to the main exercise objectives. The initial phase of Red Flag proceeded exactly as exercise planners had anticipated. F-35 pilots achieved rapid target acquisition at extended ranges, demonstrating the sensor fusion capabilities that made their aircraft the most advanced fighters ever built. Their beyond visual range missile engagements eliminated simulated threats with surgical precision while maintaining safe standoff distances that minimized exposure to enemy defensive systems. The exercise controllers monitored these developments with satisfaction, watching their carefully designed scenarios unfold according to predetermined parameters. Captain Stevens led Alpha Flight in a sweep of the northern combat area, his four-ship formation maintaining perfect tactical spacing, while their sensors painted detailed pictures of the airspace ahead. Sabre lead has multiple contacts bearing 090, range 45 miles. Stevens reported over the radio, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that marked experienced F-35 pilots. Request permission to engage with a IM-120D. The engagement proceeded flawlessly, with all four missiles finding their targets before the simulated enemy aircraft could respond or maneuver defensively. Elena monitored these communications from her assigned holding pattern in the southern exercise area, noting the predictable tactics and standard procedures that characterized F-35 employment. The Lightning II pilots were fighting exactly as their training had taught them, maintaining technological advantages through careful range management and superior situational awareness. Their approach was methodical, efficient, and completely dependent on the automated systems that processed threat information and provided targeting solutions. But Elena had spent weeks studying these same tactics, identifying patterns and assumptions that could be exploited by someone willing to operate outside conventional parameters. When exercise controllers finally cleared her to begin her assigned patrol route, she immediately deviated from the predetermined flight path, descending to low altitude where terrain masking would degrade radar coverage and complicate target tracking. The F-16 dropped below the radar horizon, disappearing from surveillance. Systems that were optimized for detecting threats at medium and high altitudes. Major Reeves noticed the anomaly first, watching Elena's radar track fade from his monitoring displays despite clear weather conditions and normal equipment operation. Range control, we've lost contact with Falcon 34. He reported to the exercise controllers using Elena's assigned call sign. Last known position was 30 miles south of Checkpoint Charlie, descending through 5,000 feet. The controllers acknowledged the report but showed little concern, assuming that Elena was experiencing radio difficulties or navigational errors that would resolve themselves quickly. Elena was indeed experiencing difficulties, but they were intentional complications designed to mask her actual intentions from electronic surveillance systems. She had shut down her identification transponder and placed her radar in passive mode, reducing electronic emissions to levels that made her aircraft nearly invisible to the sophisticated detection networks that monitored exercise activities. The F-16 hugged the desert floor at 200 feet above ground level, using terrain features and careful flight planning to remain undetected while closing the distance to more lucrative targets. Lieutenant Morrison's Bravo flight was conducting high-altitude patrol operations 40 miles northeast of Elena's last known position, when their RWR displays began showing intermittent contact warnings. The signals were weak and inconsistent, suggesting electronic interference or equipment malfunctions rather than genuine threats. Bravo lead, I'm getting weird returns on the threat warning system, Morrison's wingman reported. Probably just some old simulation equipment acting up. Morrison dismissed the warnings with the casual confidence that characterized pilots who had never encountered opposition that didn't conform to expected threat presentations. The F-35's advanced defensive systems were designed to identify and categorize known threats automatically, providing clear indications when hostile aircraft or surface-to-air missiles posed credible dangers. Weak, intermittent signals that didn't match established threat libraries were automatically classified as false returns or equipment malfunctions. Elena had anticipated this response, using the F-16's older electronic warfare systems to generate signature patterns that would confuse automated threat identification software without triggering immediate defensive reactions. The F-35 pilots were so accustomed to having their computers interpret sensor data that they had lost the ability to analyze raw electronic intelligence manually. Elena's approach exploited this dependency by providing information that the automated systems couldn't properly categorize or respond to. The first indication that something had gone seriously wrong came when Bravo 4 simply vanished from tactical displays without warning or explanation. One moment Lieutenant Chun was maintaining formation position. The next moment, her aircraft symbol disappeared entirely from data link networks, as if it had never existed. Morrison's attempts to raise Chun on radio produced only static, while GPS tracking showed her last known position as a coordinate in empty airspace, where no aircraft should have been operating. "Bravo lead, this is Alpha lead," Stevens called over the tactical frequency, his voice reflecting growing concern about developments that weren't covered in exercise planning scenarios. "We show Bravo 4 as mission killed on the network. Do you have visual contact or radio communications?" Morrison's response revealed that he was struggling to understand how his wingman could have been eliminated without any sensor indication of incoming threats or enemy aircraft in the vicinity. Elena's first engagement had been executed with surgical precision, using the F-16's superior maneuverability to achieve a firing position from below and behind Chun's F-35 while remaining undetected by the Lightning II's sophisticated sensor systems. The attack had come from the aircraft's blind spot, exploiting visual limitations and radar coverage gaps that exercise planners had never considered significant. Elena had fired a simulated AIM-9X missile from close range before disappearing back into terrain masking that made pursuit nearly impossible. The exercise controllers initially attributed Chun's elimination to equipment failure or pilot error, unable to reconcile the event with their understanding of how F-35 capabilities should perform against inferior opposition. But Elena was already positioning for her second engagement, using lessons learned from the first attack to refine her approach and target selection. The F-16 climbed rapidly through a mountain pass that provided concealment from radar surveillance while offering clear sight lines to the next formation of F-35s, conducting their patrol routes with confidence that was about to be shattered. Alpha Flight never saw the aging fighter that destroyed two of their aircraft in less than 30 seconds, striking from an impossible angle with weapons that shouldn't have been able to achieve target locks under the engagement conditions. Elena's tactical innovations were rewriting the rules of air combat in real time, proving that technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who refused to fight according to conventional assumptions. The Nellis Air Force Base Control Tower erupted into controlled chaos as radar screens displayed impossible data that contradicted every assumption about the exercise's predetermined outcomes. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, the senior air traffic controller with 15 years of experience managing complex training scenarios, stared at her display in disbelief as F-35 tracks continued disappearing from tactical networks faster than her equipment could process the changes. "Sir, we have 5 Lightning IIs showing mission-killed status," Williams reported to the tower chief, her voice maintaining professional composure despite the unprecedented situation unfolding before her. All eliminations attributed to the same unknown contact that's operating outside normal detection parameters. The chief leaned over her shoulder to verify the data, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm as he absorbed the implications of what their screens were showing. "Major." Reeves burst through the door of the exercise control room 3 floors below the tower, his tablet computer displaying real-time battle damage assessments that made no sense according to any tactical doctrine he had studied during his graduate work in aerospace engineering. "We need to pause the exercise," he announced to the assembled staff officers who were struggling to understand how their carefully orchestrated training scenario had devolved into chaos. We have an aircraft operating with capabilities that don't match any known threat presentation. Colonel Webb received the initial reports while reviewing administrative paperwork in his office, dismissing the first notification as a communications error or equipment malfunction. But when his aide, Captain Rodriguez, presented him with confirmed data showing that 5 F-35s had been eliminated by a single opposing aircraft, Webb's confidence in his understanding of modern air warfare began to crack under the weight of evidence that contradicted his fundamental beliefs. "This has to be a mistake," Webb said, rising from his desk to examine the mission data that Rodriguez had printed for his review. "There's no way a single F-16 could achieve these results against our most advanced fighters. The technological gap is too large to overcome through pilot skill alone." But the documentation was comprehensive and verified through multiple independent sources, leaving no room for technical explanations or equipment failures out in the air. Above the Nevada desert, the surviving F-35 pilots were experiencing their own crisis of understanding as they attempted to locate and engage an opponent who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Captain Stevens led the remaining Alpha Flight aircraft in an expanding search pattern, their sophisticated sensors sweeping empty airspace while Elena's F-16 continued operating from positions that should have been impossible to achieve and maintain. "Alpha Lead, this is Sabre 3, came Lieutenant Morrison's voice over the tactical frequency, strain evident in his previously confident tone. "I've got intermittent radar contacts, but nothing that correlates with visual acquisition. How is this aircraft avoiding our sensors?" The question highlighted a fundamental weakness in their training that none of them had recognized until confronted with an opponent who exploited their technological dependencies. Elena's fourth engagement eliminated Morrison himself, demonstrating tactical creativity that left the remaining pilots questioning everything they thought they knew about air combat effectiveness. The F-16 had appeared above Morrison's aircraft in a position that violated basic principles of energy management and tactical geometry, achieving a missile firing solution before disappearing into terrain masking that made immediate retaliation impossible. Lieutenant Torres, Morrison's wingman and one of the squadron's most technically proficient pilots, found himself alone in airspace that had become incomprehensible and dangerous. "Any station, this is Sabre 4, he transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice reflecting a level of uncertainty that he had never experienced during previous training scenarios. "I need immediate tactical guidance and threat assessment. Current situation is outside normal parameters." The recognition that Elena had achieved something thought impossible began spreading through the command structure as exercise controllers attempted to analyze how a single legacy aircraft had systematically defeated the most advanced fighters in the world. Phone calls between staff offices multiplied as senior officers demanded explanations for results that challenged decades of military planning and resource allocation decisions. Colonel Webb arrived at the Exercise Control Center to find a room full of specialists struggling to reconcile their theoretical knowledge with empirical evidence that contradicted their most fundamental assumptions. "I want a complete analysis of every engagement," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who needed answers immediately. "How did Captain Vasquez achieve these results? And what does this mean for our assessment of F-35 capabilities?" The preliminary analysis revealed tactical innovations that none of the planning staff had anticipated or prepared for. Elena had exploited blind spots in sensor coverage, used terrain masking more effectively than anyone thought possible, and employed engagement techniques that bypassed the automated defensive systems that F-35 pilots relied upon for threat detection and response. Her success demonstrated that technological superiority could be neutralized by opponents who understood both the capabilities and limitations of advanced systems. Major Reeves presented his initial findings to Colonel Webb with the clinical precision of someone reporting data that he himself found difficult to believe. Sir, Captain Vasquez has effectively demonstrated that our training scenarios contain significant gaps in threat presentation. Her employment techniques reveal vulnerabilities in F-35 operations that we hadn't considered relevant to peer-to-peer conflicts. The room fell silent as the implications of Reeves' assessment settled over the assembled officers. Elena had not simply achieved unexpected results. She had proven that their understanding of modern air warfare contained fundamental flaws that could prove catastrophic in actual combat situations. The comfortable certainty that had guided their tactical development was collapsing under the weight of evidence that experience and innovation could overcome technological advantages. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez received word of Elena's success through unofficial channels. Maintenance personnel passing information between aircraft service areas with the pride that came from supporting pilots who achieved extraordinary results with ordinary equipment. "I told you that bird had personality," she said to her assistant. Technical Sergeant Davis, while reviewing the mission data that confirmed Elena's 5 confirmed kills. "Captain Vasquez just proved that good pilots can make any aircraft dangerous." The official acknowledgement came when Colonel Webb personally radioed Elena's aircraft, requesting her immediate return to base for debriefing sessions that would analyze her tactical innovations for incorporation into future training scenarios. "Falcon 34, this is home plate base," Webb transmitted, his voice carrying a respect that had been absent from all previous communications. "Outstanding performance today. We need to understand how you achieved these results." Elena's response was professionally modest, but carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven points that others had refused to consider. "Home plate. Base. Falcon 34 returning as directed. Ready to discuss employment techniques and tactical recommendations." The transmission marked the beginning of Elena's transformation from marginalized pilot to tactical innovator whose insights would reshape how the Air Force approached air combat training and development. The auditorium at Nellis Air Force Base had never hosted a briefing quite like the one Elena delivered 6 weeks after Red Flag 243 concluded with results that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of military leadership. 200 pilots, weapons system officers, and tactical analysts filled every seat, while senior officers from the Pentagon observed via secure video link. Elena stood at the podium where she had once been dismissed and marginalized, now commanding the attention of an audience that hung on every word of her tactical analysis. "The fundamental assumption driving our current training philosophy is that technological superiority provides decisive advantages in air-to-air combat," Elena began, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven results rather than theoretical knowledge. Red Flag 24-3 demonstrated that this assumption contains dangerous blind spots that sophisticated opponents will exploit. The audience leaned forward as Elena clicked through slides showing her engagement sequences, each one revealing tactical innovations that had neutralized F-35 advantages through unconventional approaches. General Patricia Hayes, the newly appointed commander of Air Combat Command, watched Elena's presentation from her office at Langley Air Force Base, taking detailed notes on recommendations that would reshape pilot training throughout the Air Force. Hayes had built her career on F-22 and F-35 operations, but Elena's demonstration had forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how air superiority would be achieved in future conflicts against peer competitors who might employ similarly innovative tactics. "Captain Vasquez has identified critical vulnerabilities in our current training methodology," General Hayes said during a secure video conference with wing commanders from major air bases across the country. "We're implementing immediate changes to pilot training syllabi to address the tactical gaps she's exposed. Every F-35 pilot will receive instruction in defensive maneuvering, against unconventional threats and low-altitude combat techniques that we've neglected for the past decade. Elena's promotion to Major came with assignment as the Director of Advanced Tactical Training Development, a newly created position that gave her authority to design curricula for the entire fighter pilot community. Her office in the weapons school building occupied space that had previously housed theoretical analysts, who developed training scenarios based on computer modeling rather than operational experience. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who understood how dramatically the institutional balance had shifted. Lieutenant Morrison, now a captain himself, sat in Elena's first official class on unconventional threat employment, taking notes with the focused intensity of someone who had learned painful lessons about underestimating opponents. "Ma'am, when you achieved that fourth engagement against my flight, you were operating outside the performance envelope that our threat libraries predicted," Morrison said during the question period. "How do we train our systems to recognize similar tactics from actual adversaries?" Elena's response revealed the depth of analysis that would make her tactical innovations lasting rather than temporary adjustments. "Captain, the key insight is that threat libraries are historical documents that describe what opponents have done, not what they're capable of doing. We need to train pilots to think creatively about employment techniques while understanding that our adversaries are doing the same thing." The lesson represented a fundamental shift from reactive training to proactive, tactical development. The F-16 that had served as Elena's platform during Red Flag 24-3 was retired from active service and installed in the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Its weathered surface is now bearing a plaque that detailed its role in revolutionizing air combat training. Visitors often pause to read the inscription. This aircraft demonstrated that technological sophistication must be balanced with tactical innovation and pilot expertise to achieve air superiority in contested environments. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez received assignment to Elena's training development team, where her practical knowledge of aircraft systems and maintenance considerations became integral to designing realistic training scenarios. Major Vasquez proved that maintenance personnel are tactical partners, not just support staff, Gonzalez explained to new crew chiefs during orientation briefings. Understanding your aircraft's capabilities beyond official specifications can provide advantages that determine mission success. The ripple effects of Elena's demonstration extended far beyond pilot training to influence acquisition decisions and strategic planning at the highest levels of government. Defense contractors found themselves answering difficult questions about over-reliance on automated systems and inadequate emphasis on pilot skills development. Congressional budget committees demanded explanations for training programs that had failed to prepare pilots for innovative opponents who didn't conform to predicted threat presentations. Elena's legacy became visible in the classroom exercises that replaced the simulator-heavy training that had characterized previous pilot development programs. New lieutenants learned to fly without GPS guidance, engage targets without automated fire control systems, and navigate by visual reference when electronic systems failed or were compromised. These skills, once considered obsolete, returned to the core curriculum because Elena had proven their continued relevance. The quiet victory that began with Elena's assignment to a broken-down aircraft had evolved into institutional transformation that would influence air warfare for decades. Her patient accumulation of expertise and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom had proven that individual innovation could overcome bureaucratic resistance and technological overconfidence. The Air Force had rediscovered the value of human judgment, tactical creativity, and the kind of professional competence that couldn't be programmed into computers or purchased from defense contractors. Elena's office window overlooked the flight line where F-35s and F-16s now shared training missions, their pilots learning from each other rather than dismissing different approaches as irrelevant. The integration represented more than tactical evolution. It symbolized institutional humility and the recognition that experience deserved respect regardless of the platform that delivered it. The signal that had once been dismissed as noise had become the foundation for a new understanding of what made pilots and aircraft truly dangerous. Not the sophistication of their technology, but the wisdom and determination of those who employed it. 3 years later, Elena stood before a graduating class of F-35 pilots at Nellis Air Force Base, her colonel's insignia gleaming in the afternoon sun. The young aviators before her represented a new generation trained in the tactical philosophy. She had fought to establish one that balanced technological superiority with human innovation and tactical creativity. Your aircraft are the most advanced fighters ever built, Elena told the assembled pilots, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven herself in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. But technology is only as effective as the pilot who employs it. Never forget that your greatest weapon isn't your radar or your missiles, it's your ability to think, adapt, and overcome challenges that your opponents believe are impossible. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, the class honor graduate, raised her hand with a question that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Colonel, how do we prepare for opponents who might use unconventional tactics against our systems? Elena smiled, recognizing the fundamental shift in thinking that her demonstration had created. By remembering that every advantage can become a vulnerability if you rely on it too completely, Elena replied. Stay humble, stay curious, and never underestimate anyone, whether they're flying the newest stealth fighter or the oldest aircraft. In the inventory. As the ceremony concluded, Elena reflected on how a single moment of courage had transformed not just her career, but an entire institution's approach to air warfare. The F-16 that everyone had dismissed as junk had become the catalyst for changes that would save lives and win battles for decades to come. Elena's story proves that sometimes the most powerful victories come from refusing to accept others' limitations, finding strength in what others see as weakness, and remembering that true excellence never goes out of style. If stories like Elena's inspire you to see potential where others see problems, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share your own underdog story in the comments below. We love hearing how our viewers overcome the odds in their own lives.